and welcome back to Bite the Ballot, the TLDR News election podcast. I'm Jack, and I'm joined today by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
And Zach Michaelis.
Hello.
How are we doing?
Good.
We're doing good. I mean, we had a little chat about this podcast before we came in to record it. Yeah. And I think Ben is more enthusiastic, or Ben enjoyed the debate, I think, more than we did. Yeah. So I'm slightly more muted than Ben.
The main, if not only thing we'll be talking about today is the debate that happened between the two leaders of the two major parties on ITV last night. If you haven't seen it already, save yourself an hour and do anything else. We're going to be running through the debate, talking about how it ran, the key topics, and what points each side landed, and also the results afterwards of who the electorate think won, although the polling isn't all that large a sample size, so caveats. Before we get into the episode properly though, we have a big announcement coming out later this week, and if you want to make sure that you're one of the first people to find out about it, click the link in the description and sign up to our new mailing list, where we'll let you know what's happening first. Where do we want to start? Do you want to start with the policies and the points that each side was going for, or do we want to talk about the debate itself and the way that it kind of shook out?
I think let's start with the format, because I think for people who haven't watched it, this conversation is not going to make any sense unless people know something about the format and then by implication about how sort of detail-light the entire affair was.
Sure.
So do you want to just spell out what the format was?
So the format was that each side got about 45 seconds to answer the questions that were posed to them by audience members or that had apparently been sent into ITV in advance. And then there was some vague crosstalk discussion about kind of what the answers were in those first 45 seconds. We probably ran through about 10 different questions, I would say, if you include the relatively quick fire ones too. So although there was the additional crosstalk on top of the 45 seconds, you never got all that much deeper than that first 45 seconds, because once you said that, it was then more of a debate about, well, you said that, or what do you say about this? Or you didn't really get deeper into the policy. The 45 seconds was the deepest we got.
I think you're even being too kind. I mean, the format was just so appallingly bad. I mean, you didn't. It's not that you didn't get near the detail of the policy. You did not get past the catchphrases. I mean,
you didn't really
You literally had both sides would say their catchphrases, and Sunak's, he kept on repeating this figure that Labour are going to tax you £2,000, saying I have a plan. The plan is working. And then Starmer's were Liz Truss, constantly referencing Liz Truss.
Yeah.
You thought he was debating Liz Truss, or 14 years, or my, I'm not going to be too sort of critical of Starmer, but then a lot of my mum was a nurse, my dad was a toolmaker.
And when you're trying to get all that into 45 seconds, plus displaying some empathy for the question askers who,
of course, because you've got to do the first 10 seconds of, oh, Steve, I appreciate how you feel,
Exactly. And then once you've mentioned toolmaking and
you've got 10 seconds left to do your entire tax policy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that I think the format, not only is it just crap for having an actual conversation, maybe this is too unfair, but it's also just deeply patronising the audience. I mean, the implicit idea behind it when ITV set it up was that, presumably that they don't think the audience can tolerate, they don't have an attention span beyond 45 seconds, they don't have the attention span to deal with a slightly more in-depth policy conversation. I just think that's wrong. I think that the other thing is that I presume they're trying to do it to make it appeal to as wide an audience as possible. They don't want to have a long multi-hour debate where it gets all academic and intellectual. And presumably they're hoping that by doing that and by keeping it to 45 seconds and an hour overall, they can sort of broaden the appeal of what is quite a sort of political event. And I think we talked about basically outside the podcast, but I would imagine that even if you got a bigger viewership to begin with, the audience must have trailed off almost immediately. Yeah. I mean, I would love to see a graph of audience retention on that debate, because I reckon after the first 5 minutes, 50% of people have turned off.
It's tricky as well, because the politicians are almost incentivized to try and squeeze as much as they can into that 45 seconds, and often they struggled to last night. So they often went over, and it just came across as quite sort of petty squabbling at times. And Julie Etchingham was really trying to get them to keep within this 45 seconds, and often they didn't. And it wasn't the right sort of, it wasn't the right sort of vibe or attitude from the debate. I mean, you were wanting more of an in-depth policy discussion, and what you got was petty squabbling between the two of them trying to fit within this 45 seconds.
I think I also agree with what Zach's saying, that the format was optimizing for an audience that doesn't really exist. That the idea that people are going to be drawn into this like really quick debate I don't think is true.
No.
I think you have a whole load of people that will have very quickly, as you say, switched off because they'll realize, there is no substance here.
Yeah.
We're never going to get deeper than this. It's just politicians. They're all the same. They're just attacking each other. There is no benefit to watching. And sure, a 5-minute long answer from Sunak about tax policy might not be the most thrilling thing, but at least you're hearing something. At least you're not getting like the attitude of, well, I'm not learning anything. Why am I even watching?
Yeah, but I think if you split the audience into like sort of like diehard politicos and then sort of like normal people, yeah, no normal person is going to want to watch that. It was just like an unpleasant viewing experience, and no politico is going to want to watch it either because there's nothing interesting in there. So I just think it's but I think you would enjoy anything that was sort of election adjacent.
Fair.
You're the most diehard of diehard politicos.
Yeah.
But so I just think the format really irritated me. And I think it's a failure by the media. I do think that. I think that it's that the sort of commercial calculation by ITV was just wrong, for the reasons we just discussed. But it's also just bad for the relationship between the public and politicians because no one can look good in that format. And Sunak and Starmer, I think, especially so, because we'll get into this in a bit, but Sunak looks sort of tetchy and aggressive and snarky, and Starmer just looks almost befuddled, like he just can't say enough, and you just get, my dad was a toolmaker, and then like half a sentence on tax policy, and it just means that the public sees politicians as sort of snipey and confrontational, adversarial, and just nasty, or like not particularly bright, but that's actually just a consequence of the format, and so. I think it's really a failure of the media here. I don't want to be, I don't want to be too mean to ITV, but I think it was just bad from ITV, and also more generally the British media class, because in their sort of like post-event analysis, you were talking about the newsagents. Emily Maitlis was saying that she liked the format and thought it was good, and other mainstream media channels. I don't want to do this whole like mainstream media Joe Rogan thing.
Let's start some beef.
Yeah, but they all think this is the right format, but it's just not the right format. They all do these sort of like snippy, like 45-second or a minute limitations, and I just do think they breed bad TV for starters. But then also, I think they breed, or they sort of exacerbate the underlying mistrust between the public and their politicians.
I would say that the rest of politics were quite critical of the format as well. So Alistair Campbell didn't like it. So I wouldn't say that it's all, everybody came away from it saying it was a great
Alistair
format.
Campbell, when I was saying the mainstream media channels, I'm talking about the BBC. Emily Maitlis is a sort of better sort of representation of the BBC or the BBC sort of like groupthink than Alistair Campbell. So I just thought it was not good.
So perhaps unsurprisingly, as we now transition into the section about what was said in the debate, the answer is not much.
Not much.
I think policy-wise, we learned almost nothing. There was maybe a hint of something interesting on immigration from Keir Starmer, but honestly, not even enough to talk about. Besides that, I wouldn't say there was anything interesting from a policy perspective said, really. There was some framing of how they wanted the debate to play out. As you say, there were key lines from each side, which are worth getting into. But do we broadly agree that policy-wise, there is nothing worth talking about, and we just talk about catchphrases from here on out? Because there was nothing, right?
Well, it's hard to just draw a line then, isn't it? It's hard to draw a line between the policy and the catchphrase.
Sure.
Because the catchphrases were supposed to be the sort of condensation of the policy. And Sunak is talking about Labour are going to tax you £2,000 a year. That's a big claim, that Labour are going to tax you £2,000 a year to pay for all their big plans. That is his policy, essentially, which is that I'm not going to tax by implication, and Labour are going to do lots of big taxes.
I would say that you saw from it what I think the attack lines are going to be over the next few weeks. I mean, that was one of the useful things, that you can sort of see where Labour are going to try and go for the Tories and how the Tories are going to try and go for Labour. I thought that was quite interesting. I mean, you did have some points of genuine disagreement between the two. I mean, it wasn't, I'm in agreement with the, general criticism that we all sort of agreed on this morning about the broader debate format. But I think there were some points of genuine disagreement. So one of them was on the commitments to international organisations. Yeah. So there was I also just, as another quick point on the format, the fact that they kept going to these like yes/no questions and expecting them to just sort of like
put your hands up if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I really hated that.
It's the TikTokification of debates.
However,
like it's just looking for a tiny clip.
I will say, at the very least, there were some answers where one of them said yes and one of them said no.
True.
Obviously, one of those was on international organisations and our obligations, which I think was genuinely quite useful. I think it was
where Rishi Sunak said that he would pull out of the European,
basically the ECHR,
if he had to get Rwanda across. Starmer said, no, we need an international reputation that is solid and we can't be messing around
So I
with
think
that
it was
kind
one
of
of
stuff.
the only good bits of the debate in the sense that you had genuine disagreement, it was genuinely ideological, and there was an actual line you could draw between the two of them. And it wasn't them just going on about, 14 years and the £2,000 thing.
Also, one of the loudest applause lines, I'd say,
For both of them.
for both of them, especially for Starmer, I feel, on we've got to be a serious country kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other obvious point of disagreement was if you had a family member on a waiting list, would you take them to private healthcare?
Yeah.
Starmer said no, Sunak said yes.
I sort of back at least the honesty from Sunak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would have been silly if he'd said no.
It would have been
such a transparent lie.
I was going to say on that, I do think that is actually one of maybe the only interesting things about the debate is that, and this was very clear during the debate for anyone watching, but also reflected in the polling afterwards, is that there's a sense that it was a bit of a draw. Both neither of them performed very well, but there was a real divergence on the sort of attributes that they were sort of presenting with. Does it make sense? Or sort of the sort of characters that they wanted to play, and Sunak, in some sense, was trying to be more prime ministerial, maybe sort of more intellectual, whereas Starmer was clearly trying to be more sort of trustworthy man of the people, empathetic and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that does sort of point to a larger question about what sort of politician we want our prime ministers to be, and whether or not we want them to sort of be in this era statesman-like and sort of, I don't know. I mean, Sunak is not particularly statesman-like, but in some sense, sort of removed.
Yeah.
Whether we want a sort of man of the people, Keir Starmer-esque politician. Do you know what I mean? How well does that chat about toolmakers and my mum being a nurse play? I think it's a really interesting question because I think there's probably a sense in which Boris Johnson could get away with being the sort of very, very wealthy, sort of slightly ridiculous pseudo-aristocrat.
Yeah.
But maybe the Boris Johnson experience has turned the electorate off that sort of slightly sort of superior politician that Sunak, I think, is a very different form of superiority, but he is sort of, in a sense, he's not trying to do the man of the people stuff.
I think he was a little bit. I mean, on the sort of NHS stuff, he was very much trying to say, my dad was a GP, my mum was a pharmacist. He was trying to play the game in the same way that Starmer was, and to almost a ludicrous degree, where nearly the first half of the debate, many of the questions started with, my mum did this, my father did this, my wife does this.
I think he mentioned it a couple of times. I didn't think he mentioned that much. I think also he didn't really push back against the cost of living stuff where Starmer would say, Sunak doesn't know what it's like. And Sunak just rolled with that. He was like, yeah, fair, I don't know what it's like.
Yeah, there's no point.
I will go private.
Yeah.
And I think that is interesting. I think that does, I imagine that there's probably a slightly different idea of what the electorate wants in the Labour and Tory camps respectively. I think the Tories are probably more comfortable with Sunak presenting as, sort of admitting that he is wealthy and that he is not a man of the people, but he's a sort of competent technocrat. He's like an industry guy. Whereas Labour, I think, really do apparently, I mean, you can see this, it was clearly a strategy in the debate. Labour really think there is electoral value in presenting Keir Starmer as the man of the people, as it were. And I think that's interesting because I'm not sure which is right. I think that the polling after the debate, the YouGov polling, said that people thought Sunak, 50% of people thought Sunak won, 50% of people thought Starmer won. I know I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but I think it's interesting. But there was a big divide, but people thought, who's more trustworthy and who's more likable. It was 75 to Starmer, 25 Sunak. And how to square those two facts, the fact that people found Starmer overwhelmingly more likely, more likable and more trustworthy, and yet not necessarily more prime ministerial, I think is interesting. And I think that which of those two emotions better motivates voting behaviour is an open question and will be very interesting going forwards. I do think that my intuition is that the electorate is more keen for a trustworthy, amiable politician as opposed to someone who is sort of prime ministerial in that traditional sense.
And Starmer clearly did try a little bit to show his credentials beyond kind of his likability and toolmakeriness in the kind of question around security and can he be trusted. And to be honest, a number of times he referenced his previous work at the Crown Prosecution Service and used that as a way of showing, look, I know what I'm doing, I can be trusted. I have experience of running a public body like that. I know what it's like. And sure, that's not being prime minister, but it's closer than most prime ministers come to doing a prime minister equivalent job. There's not many equivalents, and I'm not saying this is either, but that was a pretty good example of I can be trusted. I can do more than just the kind of I'm a trustworthy, nice guy. But I agree, they definitely were going different tacks with their kind of approach. And they definitely presented themselves in different ways. I think besides that moment where Starmer got a little bit heated when it was implied that he couldn't be trusted, I think he certainly kept a more chilled vibe. He was less shouty and interrupty than Sunak was. But equally, Sunak doesn't really have the kind of, he's not able to just be the chill, like, they're messing this up, trust me energy, because he's the one that's messing it up.
If on
talking points then, because we've kind of jumped forward, to jump back again about what they're actually saying, the key talking points from, let's start with Sunak, were obviously tax rises. There'll be £2,000 of additional tax under Keir Starmer. And also, I suppose, there was a lot of like vague hand waving around kind of pensioners being screwed over, that kind of stuff.
That was interesting.
So
there was also the whole line of, we have a plan, Starmer doesn't.
Clear, bold action. Yes. Which one? Let's tackle those one at a time. I'll let you choose order. Ben.
As in,
what do you take of those arguments? What do you?
So I think the attack line of like, so the plan one, right? I think that's something that we've heard quite a lot in the last few weeks of like, we've got a plan, we've got a thing to stand by, we've got a track record, and we've got policies that we're coming out with. And we saw this when he spoke about national service as well, was that we have a plan, we're going to take bold action, Labour don't have a plan. Labour, you know, they all they've done is criticise, which to be fair, I mean, was his job as leader of the opposition, but all he's done is criticise. And it's an interesting one. I think that there will be some cut through with that. I think some people do think that Labour just haven't been strong enough on actually explaining what they'll do in government. And Starmer has come out with about, is it 5 or 6 points, his like plan that he's sort of tried to be this like big, almost like campaign launch, but I don't know how much cut through that has. I don't know what the 6 are off the top of my head in the same way that I know what's Sunak's 5 points were. So I think that this whole sort of like Labour don't have a plan thing, I think there is purpose in going for that. I think there will be cut through on that, at least until the manifesto when they have something properly to point to. But he was really going in on that, and I think there is some sense in doing that.
Yeah, I don't know that Starmer helped himself in that regard either. I think not. He obviously also wasn't helped by the format, the fact that you could never really get deep enough to really lay out decent policy. But admittedly, Sunak didn't lay out many policies either, but he did have clear things that he stood for in a way that I think Starmer didn't. Do you think Starmer and Labour should have done more in the run-up and throughout the debate to present an alternative? Because admittedly, I'm not sure they did.
Yeah, I think Starmer was genuinely quite weak on hitting back when he said that they don't have a plan. He didn't go through what his 6 points were. He didn't really like present any sort of like list of things that he would do. I think he came across really weak in defending against that.
Yeah.
And I think this is sort of true of Starmer throughout the debate, was that when he was attacked on something, I think his defence to it came either too late or was too weak.
Yeah, the £2,000 one.
So the £2,000 one,
example.
that was the worst example, because he said that, you know, Labour will increase your taxes by £2,000. About 5 or 6 times before we actually said, oh, this is a nonsense figure, this is rubbish, this had been, you know, the academics that came up with this sort of, are trying to sort of discredit them. And it just came too late. And I think that was true of the £2,000 thing, and I think it was true of the Labour don't have a plan. Like, he should have been stronger on that. He should have listed what the 6 things were, or at least some of them, and he should have done it more strongly and much more quickly.
Yeah, the £2,000 one especially, I think, is so easy to prepare for, I feel.
Yeah.
The idea that Labour are going to put your taxes up is an election campaign strategy from the Tories for as long as election campaign strategies have existed.
Yeah.
So not hitting back on that immediately and allowing that to kind of like settle into the debate and become like a key talking point. And then he tried to defend against it, but wasn't really allowed to, because Juliet Etching wanted to move on to the next section because like it had kind of already been covered and like been let lie, I think is a real weakness there.
So I just think a whole lot, this is going to be a sort of, I think a whole lot of things simultaneously. It's going to be sort of a confused blubble of just like thoughts here.
Go on, blubble.
So I'm just going to, there's not even a word.
It's not, I like it.
But so I think a whole lot of things can be simultaneously true, right? Which is that Sunak is sort of right to point out the lack of Labour policy, or I don't think that's not quite right, because Labour actually do have a ton of policies. They just never get any attention. There's something that, by the way, Stephen Bush at the FT is really good about. Labour go around the country popping up with new wild policies here, there, and everywhere. Normally, it's not Keir Starmer. Normally, it's someone like Wes Streeting who just goes to GP surgery and goes like, "We're going to do this." And there are loads of policies. And I think that Starmer should have done better at sort of pointing those out and sort of referring to those when he, Sunak was saying you have no plan. But Sunak is right fundamentally in that Labour doesn't have a plan to fix the big structural problems in the economy. They're all tinkering around the edges. And so Sunak has a serious point here when he goes, clearly, 14 years of us ballsing everything up. You keep saying this, Starmer, and this is me being Sunak speaking to Starmer. You keep saying this. So what's your big plan to fix all of these, mess ups? And Starmer he doesn't have a big sort of like eye-catching plan, largely because he doesn't want to do anything dangerous with taxes. He just wants to be like hyper-conservative with taxes, which I think is the right electoral strategy, because I think that basically he can survive the next 5 weeks by, based on where that question comes up, just sort of deflecting away to, well, the Tories' plan is crap, plus, look, the Tories broke everything. I think he can survive 5 weeks by doing that. But I think if you are going to survive the 5 weeks by doing that, as you guys say, you have to be quicker at deflecting. Because the way, when Sunak says, like, you don't have a plan, what you have to do then is rattle off a couple of quick policies, even if they're not like fully funded or they're not going to make a dent in the enormous structural problems in the UK, and then say, well, your plan is rubbish. But he wasn't very good at it. He just got caught flat-footed every time. I think it won't make a difference, though, because I think he'll just say no to future debates. I also think that other Labour politicians are probably quick on their feet. So I think that, like, for example, the upcoming debate where Angela Rayner is going to be in it, I think she'll be way better than he is. But I think that was just the sort of the main criticism I'd have of him, is that the main line of criticism against Starmer is that without doing massive tax hikes, you can't fix all the big problems that you say you're going to fix. And he's just right about that. But Starmer has to just deflect away from that.
Yeah.
And then, probably just hike taxes once he's won a massive majority.
Interesting this morning, I don't know if you've seen the BBC reporting that 2 senior civil servants are disputing Sunak's figure and saying the £2,000 hasn't come from them.
They're saying it shouldn't be presented as civil service.
So that is an interesting counterpoint landing this morning. It'll be interesting to see whether that makes any dent from the public perception of both Sunak's trustworthiness and the number as a whole. But it certainly seemed to land last night, and Starmer did little to defend it.
Yeah.
On the other side, obviously, Starmer was talking about the 14 years in power, the crashing the economy, the Liz Truss of it all. What do we make of those kind of arguments? Those were his key talking points, really.
Well, I think that Labour really want to talk about the past 14 years. Like, that is very much, it sort of benefits them to talk about the last 14 years, because from their point of view, you can say, the Tories haven't done anything in that time. You've got austerity in that time. You've got COVID. You've got all these different things that you can sort of point to Tory failure on. So for them, it benefits to talk about the past. But for the Tories, they very much want to talk about the future. They want to talk about like the fact that Labour has no plan for the future. And throughout the debate, it just seemed like they were talking past each other in that Labour were constantly trying to bring it back to 14 years, Liz Truss and all that, which I don't know how much the public... I think the public care to a point on that. I don't think bringing Liz Truss up as much as it was in any way useful. We all know what happened with Liz Truss, and we all sort of know that Sunak was not really on board with it. There was one point in the debate, I think, where I can't remember what he was asked, but he was asked. Starmer was sort of pinned at one point, and he sort of tried to pivot away by saying, "Well, he didn't speak out that much against Liz Truss." I can't remember which point of the debate it was. But anyway, I just thought that came across as quite petty and quite weak and almost like it was quite an obvious deflection. I just think that they were sort of talking past each other a lot, and that there was no sort of agreement on how to respond to like a policy thing. Anytime a policy was brought up, Starmer wanted to talk about the past, Sunak wanted to talk about the fact that they didn't have, that Labour don't have a plan. And it all just got lost in that. It seemed just sort of pointless.
I just think that the mistake, again, that Starmer's making here is to focus in isolation and myopically on the past, because you're right, the electorate don't buy it. The electorate don't... Sure, Liz Truss happened, but we can't go back and fix it. The electorate know it. Just saying, like, oh, Liz Truss was bad.
And he also knew that Sunak wasn't really on board with Liz Truss.
But I think the issue here is that what Starmer failed to do, and what was really... It's just really simple. It's not difficult. You have to link the past to the future. You just have to say, like, it doesn't matter what Sunak says about the future. His record is appalling. Whenever Sunak says, I have a big, strong plan, you have to just link the failures of the past to the future. The response to Sunak saying, I have this grand plan, is not Liz Truss was bad. It's that, look, sure, you have this plan, but the Tories had a plan in 2019. They had a plan in 2015. They had a plan in 2010. And every time the plan has failed. You had a plan a year ago, and your plan has already failed. Why should we trust this plan?
Yeah.
And the fact that Starmer failed to make that link, because that is it's not even just like the politically salient argument. It's also the logical argument. Like, I'm very sympathetic to Sunak's basic idea that, like, we shouldn't just focus myopically on the past. Elections should be about what happens next. That's just, of course it is. That's just the rational thing to do. You can't change the past. You can change the future.
Yeah.
But Starmer just failed to sort of link those two arguments together. And I don't think that bodes well for him. I think that when I was talking about it, I think that was one of the most glaring shortcomings for a politician to do. It's such an easy link to make. And I think Ben is entirely right that Starmer failed to capitalise on 14 years of failure because he just didn't link it to the future.
Only two times he did reference that really were when he called out the kind of failure on waiting lists and on boats versus the plans that Sunak had when he first came into office. And even then, you're right, the link wasn't as strong as it could have been to draw that. I think actually one of the only entertaining moments of the entire night was the waiting list thing about it getting shorter. That's the only clippable, interesting part of the entire evening. And I think it was like an okay moment for Starmer. Like it does make Sunak look silly, but even still, it's not a death blow by any means.
I think that was the only part where Starmer sort of resoundingly got a hit really on Sunak, was when Sunak was saying, oh, the waiting list is coming down. Was he saying it was from 7.5 million to 7.2 million or something?
Yeah.
And Starmer was saying, well, no, or 7. He was saying
it's come down.
Yeah, it come down. Starmer had said it's gone from
numbers.
7.2 to 7.5. And then Sunak had replied with something like, oh, it's coming down from when it was high, which is he was laughed at.
Yeah, I mean, rightly so. That's a crazy argument.
But that was the only point at which he really got him. Like, he was there with the numbers, and that was the only time where the actual criticism sort of worked, because it was like, as you say, it was sort of like a failure of the past, and it's sort of saying, well, you haven't fixed the waiting list. Why can we trust you to fix the waiting list going forward?
Which is the logical next step that was never verbalised.
That's my point. It's such an easy political move, and the fact that Starmer failed to make it. In general, now I'm just being mean to everyone.
Go on.
But I was disappointed with Starmer. I thought he has so much sort of ammo to fire at Sunak, and I think he made really weak work of it.
Yeah.
It was a draw, but it shouldn't have been a draw. Me and Ben were talking about this beforehand. I actually did think that Sunak would win. But I think Ben's basic reasoning that Starmer had so much ammo in the tank, and Sunak is already so unpopular, and he's not a good debater. Starmer just should have won.
Yeah, Sunak is actively bad in these environments normally. He often comes across as
tetchy,
overly hostile, tetchy, which he did, but Starmer was no better.
Well, that is the thing, goes back to the thing I was talking about earlier. Which
no
I do think
better in different ways.
Yeah,
he wasn't
I do
as
think
tetchy and whatever.
And I do think that is the interesting question, by the way, is that the polling suggests that people thought it was a draw, but I think you can't really trust immediate polling. And I think the more interesting question is, it'll harden Sunak's reputation as tetchy and slightly dislikable, and a bit sort of nervous. And it will also sort of nurture Starmer's reputation as a slightly softer politician, a sort of friendlier, centrist dad sort of thing.
Yeah.
And which of those is politically optimal is an open question. My intuition is actually that I think, in a sense, that means Starmer will win, because I think you're just more likely to vote for the person who's just a bit nicer. I think in the current political environment, I think we have a niceness deficit. On this note, though, by the way, I think the main winner, and this goes back to my long-running theory about the Lib Dems going to win this election. The main winner, I do think here, is Ed Davey. I think Ed Davey I really think he's running a very astute campaign. Some people think it's a bit boring, but he's hitting headlines.
It's not boring.
Well, some people think it's a bit
politically
flippant.
boring, but yeah.
But he's making headlines, and I think the reason he makes headlines is that there is this overwhelming sense.
It's because he's going down slides.
But
yeah, everyone's got access to slides. Why are the rest of them not doing it?
Sunak's a millionaire, get his own slide. But the reason I think, and what Ed Davey's been capitalising very nicely on is that there was a massive happiness deficit in British politics. It reminds me a bit of actually the Spanish election in about 2015, I think it was, when Podemos ran a campaign saying we're going to make Spain smile again. I mean, it wasn't actually a great campaign for Podemos; they didn't win, but it's still interesting. It was deliberately it was just about the sort of depressiveness.
It's easy to be interesting, though. It's that's not.
I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that it is easy for politicians to be interesting. I think you see that with both Starmer and Sunak. Neither of them are interesting, and they're both trying to be interesting.
Because they're both trying to win. If you're choosing between trying to run a campaign to win or to be interesting, run it to win.
Fine, but then I think they're both making a political miscalculation, because I think there was a real happiness deficit. And I think one of the things that actually announced people to Boris Johnson originally was his endless optimism and the good vibes. The thing you can't deny about Boris Johnson is that he had good vibes. He was fun. You know, but just hear me out here, and the data is with me on this one. Fun politicians, opposite politicians, just do win. Yeah, they just do. And the thing with that debate is that neither of them looked fun or happy. Yeah. And I think that again marks this very stark contrast with grinning slapstick comedy Ed Davey, who, I think he is carving out a little bit of a space for him. I also think the other big winner then obviously is Nigel Farage, because when it comes to looking sort of personable and relatable, and I think especially honest, no one does that better than Nigel Farage.
I would just say that comparing Ed Davey to Boris Johnson, I don't think he's reasonable in the slightest. I don't think that they're both trying to run. They're both trying to be positive figures, but they're going about it in they went about it in very, very different ways.
But that's my point. I just said that. My point is that they're both trying to be sort of positive, optimistic figures, and they're both going to...
Boris Johnson did it in a way that helps him win a campaign. Ed Davey is doing a thing that just helps him get headlines that isn't helping. Like, I don't think this is going to help him that much. And also, he's not...
Well, let's see. Let's see if the polling bears out.
I would also point out that Ed Davey, on Friday, there's a leaders debate, and I know that Sunak and Starmer have pulled out, but Ed Davey also pulled out of that one. Like, he's not on that debate. So far, the only thing that most people have seen from him at the end of this week in the campaign is him doing some silly stunts. Yeah, but they won't have had anything on policy.
But what would you have seen of him if he hadn't done the silly stunts?
Yeah, you would have seen nothing.
I've not seen any of.
Could have seen him on Friday.
You just don't like that.
True. Yeah, but I've not seen Starmer on the campaign trail at all. That hasn't broken through. No moments from the campaign trail have broken through at all.
And also, what policies have you got from either Starmer or Sunak? You got a made-up number, £2,000. You got some vague stuff about the ECHR. But you can get as much of that. Ed Davey, the good thing about Ed Davey's been doing is he's been talking quite a lot about, in his public media appearances, when people have to go find him on a slide somewhere or in a river. The one policy he has been talking about quite a lot, by the way, and I think things are not fair to Ed Davey, is his social care policy. Yeah, and he's been talking basically a lot about how he wants to spend. His main priorities are getting social care things sorted, which was Theresa May's idea back in 2017, but she failed to do it because it was very unpopular. But it's hard to take him seriously on social care when he's talking about it falling off of a kayak or something. It's just hard to take someone seriously when they're talking about serious policies going down a big inflatable anachronistic take on politicians. I think I can take that. I can square those two things psychologically. I can listen and have fun.
No, but those two, I don't know. I just think
you're such a square.
No, you are. No, I just feel like.
Say yes.
I just feel like...
Can you put your hand up if I'm wrong? You are such a square.
Should we have a vote right now?
I just feel like if he's going to try and get policy across, there are better ways to do it. He's trying to get headlines, and I think there's definitely benefit to that. I just think he's leaning too far into it.
This was supposed to be a debates conversation, and now it's going to Lib Dem
into this
because in the context of debates. But how can you think there are better ways to get policy across? No one would know anything. No one would know anything about Lib
Dems. How can I think policy across than doing it on an inflatable slide? I don't know. Maybe
because the cameras have turned up. He's actually got someone. He's got Sky News, the front page of Sky News, to report on Ed Davey's social care policy.
My point is that you can do that up to a point, but when you run the whole campaign, nearly every day last week, it was a different gimmick that he used. And my point
was on a new inflatable every day.
He's got a new slide. There's a new sort of company he's gone and tried.
At least once he's done with this job, he can go and transition to lobby for big inflatables. He's got them on board.
You can do it up to a point. I just think he's massively, massively overdoing it. And at some point, he's got to talk about policy substance on an environment that is not childish.
So let's just see. I think this week we're disagreeing. So you don't like it clearly. I do like it. But the thing we're actually disagreeing about is whether or not we think the public will like it.
Yes,
I think the public will like it. We can see how the polling bears out in the next couple of weeks. But I do think there is a real happiness and optimism deficit in British politics, and I do think that Ed Davey fills that gap. I also think in the same way that debate betrayed a real honesty deficit in British politics, in part because of the format, for reasons we just discussed, but I think the person who capitalises on that is Nigel Farage. We probably should talk about Nigel Farage now because we haven't done a podcast since he re-announced.
Yes.
And this debate is this episode about a debate has turned into an Ed Davey special, so we probably want to pivot. But yes, Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage, for people who don't know or don't religiously watch our videos on TLDR UK, is back and he's running as an MP in Clacton.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Clacton.
So he's heading up the Reform Party. Me and Ben were talking about, we think he was basically baited into it by Piers Morgan, who on Question Time basically asked him a million times, why are you not running then?
Yeah.
You little bitch. And that was enough to get him going. And I do think, I think whatever you think about Nigel Farage, he's such a good communicator. He gave that, it was a Reform launch speech, wasn't it?
Yes.
Basically, he gave this, it was called a general election emergency announcement. It was basically where he said he was going to do it. And it's just like a sort of unscripted 30-minute monologue, but I don't like his politics, but it comes across as authentic, it comes across as sincere. He had really competent and great answers to every question thrown at him. And I do think the Tories are in real trouble here because, I mean, everyone knows why, but basically Nigel Farage will clean up the votes to the right of the Tories and Sunak gets squeezed by Labour and the centre and Reform on the right. And I just think for most voters, Farage is a better politician and a more votable politician than Sunak. I just do. Especially given the honesty deficit. I think he looks like the only honest politician in British politics.
I mean, the actual like launch, as you say, like that was the best demonstration of him as a good communicator that I've seen. Like he did it with no notes. He did it
no kayaks, no inflatables.
Yeah, the best thing about it was he didn't do it on a massive inflatable. But
Imagine if he had.
Well, but throughout that, he was, as you say, he was asked questions, and all of his answers came across as quite human and quite. And again, I don't like his politics either, but he is just objectively a good communicator, and I do think that this is really going to this objectively is going to really hurt the Conservatives. I mean, Sir John Curtis came out the other day and said that just him running would probably cause the Tories to lose an extra 60 seats,
which is wild,
which is huge.
And also, one of the things we forget is that we've had so much churn in politics that most of these politicians haven't been around for very long. I mean, Starmer feels like a pretty old name, but he's only been on the block for a couple of years. Farage has been in the headlines for decades.
Yeah, he knows what he's doing.
He knows what he's doing. He is the most seasoned politician of the lot. And I think we also saw another really good demonstration of his sort of like political abilities when he got milkshaked on his first appearance, and his response was something like, "My milkshake brings all the journos to Clacton," or something like that.
Something like that.
It was good. You know what? And
he showed up with more milkshakes.
It's gimmicky and it was good. And he just rolls with it. And I just, if I was Sunak, I'd be feeling terrible about it. I also just don't think that there is much policy space left for Sunak if Farage is there, because he'll be tempted, and he clearly is going to tack to the right on stuff like immigration to try and cover off the Farage threat. But who is more plausible when it comes to immigration? If you want to cut immigration, you're going to vote Reform. You're not going to vote Tory.
Not when they've been attempting it for 14 years now.
And also, this is a very recent policy announcement. So the Tories have just announced, basically, they're going to put a flat cap on migration, which is only really, it's not very done in very many countries. Most countries have sort of visa systems, which are sort of flexed depending on how many people meet your criteria. Only really the US has a sort of flat cap in that way. So it's pretty extreme policy. But Farage is already out saying, look, you said tens of thousands in 2010 with David Cameron. You said it every manifesto since, and you've come nowhere near it.
He's doing what Starmer should have done.
Farage is just so much better as a political communicator than either Starmer or Sunak. I'd be interested to see how it affects the Labour vote. I mean, one of the things that Farage kept on pointing out during his press conference was that actually, he has a very good sort of like, all you journos sort of thing going on. He's like, you journos said I would cripple the Tory vote in 2017, when was it, 2019?
19.
Didn't he pull out?
No, he pulled out 19, so 17.
17, he was like, well, actually, I took more Labour votes than I took Tory votes.
Which was true of UKIP, I think, in 15 as well.
Yeah, but obviously, if you take, first past post system, and you take 5% off both parties, that helps Labour, because it's just the way the electoral maths works out.
I think also it's worth noting that there is a very, very good chance he's going to win in Clacton, which means he will be an MP in the next Parliament, which would be very, very interesting to witness. If the Tories are reduced by the amount that we're expecting them to, and Farage sits in the Commons, you can imagine what some feisty debates and Prime Minister's questions are going to look like. Also, I think that's going to really help this almost inevitable right-wing lurch that we're going to see with the Conservative Party if they do lose, as much as we're expecting them to. I think he's really going to sort of goad them a bit in the Commons. It's going to be very, very interesting to see. I mean, there was some polling done about if there was a generic Reform candidate standing in Clacton and the Tories would win. And then this was back in January, and they polled it. They did the inverse and said if Farage was standing in Clacton, and he beats them quite resoundingly. Obviously, polling has changed since January, but I think it's certainly not got much better for the Tories since January. No. So I think it's likely that he's going to end up an MP.
I think it'd be a two-horse race, Ed Davey versus Nigel Farage for this election.
The real winners of the debate.
Yeah.
No one was expecting that. Thumbnail was who won the debate. The answer is Ed Davey and Nigel Farage.
Yeah, well, I think that's sort of everything.
So do I.
Yeah, nice. That was quick.
I don't know if it was.
No, I mean like this very ending
Oh,
bit.
the ending was abrupt. It was a very abrupt ending. Join us again next week for another episode of Bite the Ballot. We'll be discussing everything that happens between now and then. Maybe the debate that no one's turning up to. And yeah, we'll be back next week. Continue watching on TLDR UK for our full coverage, as well as on all the other channels. And we'll see you next Wednesday.
Whenever happens, it'll be some. The thing's Thursday.
We're good at scheduling. That is the one thing. We're so good at scheduling.
I think it is supposed to be Thursday.
Thursday.
We'll be back on Thursday.
It's just Wednesday because it's a debate special.
Unless something special happens next week.
Yeah, that's true.
But there isn't a debate next Wednesday.
Something else special could happen.
Could do.
Bigger slides. Even bigger slides.
You could go for like a new mode of transport. Do you know what I mean? You could be flying across London.
Oh, like some kind of like Red Bull Felix Baumgartner kind of stunt. Jumping from the stratosphere.
He's got the right sort of form for it. Do you know what I mean?
He does.
All right. That's enough.
I think we're actually done now.
Yeah, we're done.